This episode of Food for Thought is brought to you by the listeners of this podcast. That means you. You can show your support for this podcast by becoming part of our Patreon family. Just go to joyfulvegan.com/donate and choose the level that's right for you. You can also click on the link in the show notes. Thank you so much in advance. Welcome to Food for Thought, the place to explore, celebrate, and manifest a life motivated and defined by unconditional compassion and optimal wellness. My name is Patrick-Goudreau. I'm your host. You can learn more about who I am and what I do by visiting my website, joyfulvegan.com. Today's topic is Public Memorials and Monuments to Animal Advocates, Part 2. Welcome, everyone, and hello. I hope you're doing fabulously well. I'm recording this episode having recently returned from a little time up in the Pacific Northwest. Thanks to everyone who came out to our Seattle meetup and our Vancouver meetup. And of course, thanks to our friends Bridie and Seb from World Vegan Travel for hosting us in their beautiful home in Squamish. We had an incredible time hiking and picnicking and exploring the beauty in this part of the world. And we also scouted Whistler, where I'm considering hosting a Joyful Vegan destination retreat. So it'd be a conference, Joyful Vegan conference / Joyful Vegan trip. So go to joyfulvegantrips.com. You can put your name on the list if you're interested in that. It's also just a couple weeks before we leave for our Joyful Vegan trip to the French countryside, which I've been talking about for years. It got canceled because of COVID back in 2020. And I'm very excited to finally go. Very excited to finally see the things and the places that we've been excited about. And you will hear about these things because they are all relevant to this podcast. I imagine writing a podcast episode about eating vegan in a place where animal products are quite revered in the French countryside, having a separate episode on Europe's very first elephant sanctuary, which is part of our trip, and going to Lascaux Caves, one of the world famous prehistoric caves, which is adorned with Paleolithic cave paintings of animals. And I've been wanting to see Lascaux Caves for many, many, many years. So I'm really excited about that. So let me know if there are other topics you're interested in, and I will add them to the list. And just before we start today's episode, don't forget, we have several trips open for booking right now. We have officially opened up our November 2024 trip to Rwanda, where, of course, you can join me to visit mountain gorillas and chimpanzees and golden monkeys in their natural habitat. It's an incredible trip. This will be our fourth trip. One, two, three. Actually, this will be our fifth time going to Rwanda, fourth Joyful Vegan trip. And it's quite life-changing. So you can join me by going to joyfulvegantrips.com and booking your spot there. It's already filling up. Our Japan trip for 2024 sold out in 36 hours. So we added a second trip and it's now 100% confirmed. That means it's definitely happening and there are spots available, but don't delay. Go to joyfulvegantrips.com for that one as well. So that's Italy, that's Japan. And then Italy, of course, we're going back to I say, of course, because you know how much I love Italy. We're going back to quintessential Tuscany. We stay in our own vegan villa. We dine on the most exquisite plant-based cuisine. Of course, everything's plant-based, everything's vegan. And we just stroll among our own olive trees and grapevines, and we can walk to San Gimignano, and we go to all of these incredible medieval hill towns and have a wonderful time. So that's Tuscany. And then northern Italy, we hike in the Italian Alps. We have our own boat on Lake Garda. We are in our own gondolas in the canals in Venice. So it's quite an incredible trip. That one is northern Italy. And then we have one more trip in 2023 left. You can join us for still. That is a trip that has been confirmed 100%. This is the magical Noel in Alsace. This is in November, December 2023. Is it November? I think it's December 2023. And this is where we have, just cobblestone lined villages and fairy lights and castles and wine and Alsatian fare. And we go to the Black Forest to visit a bear and wolf sanctuary. So we do go to Germany. We're in Alsace. We're right on the border of France and Germany. We go into Germany, we go into Switzerland. So it's a really lovely trip. So you can see all of the details of all of these trips at joyfulvegantrips.com. Now let's get on to our episode. This is part 2 of public monuments and memorials to animal advocates. We did part 1 already, and we focused mostly on Henry Bergh, George Angell, Carolyn Earl White, really the founders of the early animal protection movement in the United States. I also talked about Jack London. And as I said in part 1, my hope is that you come away with some understanding of animal protection history. These episodes are not meant to be just straightforward histories of the animal protection movement. It's really about celebrating animal advocates through monuments and memorials, and where do we find them? Not just in the United States. We're going to talk today about the UK as well, but you will come away with an understanding of animal protection history because the monuments and memorials for most of the people were people who were founders of the movement. And so hopefully you're coming away with some understanding of animal protection history, whether you're an animal advocate or not. If all you've ever done, which is adopt an animal from a shelter, which is a lot, you are part of a line of compassionate people through the ages who have made a significant difference for non-human animals. It's so easy to take for granted that how it is today is how it's always been, but it's not, of course. It's because of determined and dedicated and compassionate men and women who hard-won battles for animals in the public, in policy, in the legal arenas, that we have what we have today, including the animal shelter. And we talked about Carolyn Earl White, who really is she founded animal shelters. There hadn't been animal shelters prior to her. So I really encourage you to listen to part 1 if you haven't yet. These people deserve to be acknowledged. They deserve to be remembered, which is exactly what we're talking about today. Public memorials to these individuals because of their work on behalf of animals. Now, we've talked about people who are pretty well known in the public eye. I don't think Carolyn Earl White is a household name. Henry Bergh, maybe on the border of being, I think people may have heard of his name, but not sure. And part of the reason I'm doing these episodes is because I want these names to be household names. These people are heroes. In my opinion, these are the heroes of our world, of the world we inhabit, those of us who care about animals. And again, wherever you are in the spectrum of your own journey, just if you care about dogs and cats, these people were and are heroes. If you care about horses, if you care about farmed animals, if you care about rats, if you care about the animals who are considered the lowliest of the lowliest in our society, these episodes are for you. So I hope you listen to part 1 and enjoy it. Today, let's continue this conversation, starting with memorials that serve a dual purpose. And that is public fountains. And I don't mean little water fountains for people to drink from in regional parks, little fountains. I mean massive stone structures whose primary function, when they were erected, was to provide water for thirsty and overworked horses, but which also reflected cultural values, societal progress, and a sense of civic responsibility. They also became a way to recognize and honor the people and the organizations who fought on behalf of these animals. They have a really interesting history. So public drinking fountains for horses, also known as horse troughs or horse waterers, were a significant development in urban infrastructure during the 19th and early 20th centuries. They provided a convenient source of water for horses who were all over the streets of every major city in the United States and in the UK as well. And they were widely used and they suffered immensely. They were used for transportation, they were used for hauling, they were used for many things. And their suffering was seen all over. I know today we talk about the animals, the horses who are used for carriage rides. And really that is just a small indication. You can just get a glimmer, a glimpse of what it would have looked like for hundreds and thousands of horses who were on the streets of cities all over the United States. So the introduction of public drinking fountains for horses can be attributed to several individuals and organizations who recognize the need to provide water to these working horses, particularly SPCAs. Now, if you go back to part one, you'll hear about the founding of the first SPCA in the United States, and that was the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and that was founded by Henry Bergh, and he was inspired by the RSPCA, which was the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals from the UK. Now, we also talked about one notable figure who was associated with the installation of horse troughs, and that was George Thorndike Angell, the founder of the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. In the late 19th century, Angell initiated a campaign to install horse water troughs in cities, particularly Boston. He was in Massachusetts. So the MSPCA worked alongside municipal authorities and private donors to fund and install these fountains. And the installation of these troughs initially gained traction as a public welfare initiative in many cities. You can see how so many ripple effects took place. You have one person doing what they know is the right thing to do on behalf of animals, and you have all these people who were inspired from them. And so these fountains were strategically placed near busy streets or transportation hubs to provide easy access to water for horses. During the 1860s, a wave of philanthropic organizations and governmental bodies across the U.S. initiated the funding and construction of these water fountains. Notably, we have the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, ASPCA's fountain in Union Square in New York City in 1867. And then, right after that, in 1869, we have, in Philadelphia, the commencement of the Philadelphia Fountain Society. So this was a major, massive, prevalent endeavor in the mid 1800s in cities all across the US. So you have the Philadelphia Fountain Society. Now, the Philadelphia Fountain Society was the brainchild of a medical doctor. His name was Dr. Swan, Dr. Wilson Carey Swan. And the society received its charter in 1869 under the leadership of Dr. Swan. And so the mission of this foundation, the society, this organization, was to facilitate the creation of water fountains and troughs throughout Philadelphia. And Dr. Swan articulated the society's purpose: the erection and maintenance in the city of public drinking fountains for the health and refreshment of the people of Philadelphia and the benefit of dumb animals. Now remember again, dumb did not mean stupid. It meant unable to speak. And so that's how a lot of animals were often referred to in the Victorian era, both in the US and the UK. The ambitious goals of this society extended beyond human well-being. It also extended to animals. And so you can see, and we talk about this a lot, the multifaceted approach to civic engagement and to public welfare involved both humans and non-humans. And you see that a lot in these organizations, because originally the idea for some of these fountains were to provide clean drinking water for city dwellers who otherwise were becoming sick because of cholera and other waterborne diseases that were killing people. And so the cities wanted to provide a way for people to be able to have clean drinking water. And then that of course extended to non-human animals. So Dr. Swan envisioned these water fountains as catalysts for improved quality of life. He was a doctor, after all, for both the laborers, people in the cities, and the animals the laborers relied upon. So dual purpose here. And underneath this was also a mind toward temperance advocacy. Some people believed that if people had clean water, they wouldn't go to local taverns. And so they would be able to quench their thirst in a healthy manner rather than go to pubs to drink beer. And so the temperance movement was also kind of behind this as well. And so Dr. Swan started this foundation, started this society, and he was most likely influenced by the precedent set by the London Metropolitan Drinking Fountain and Cattle Trough Association, which was established in 1859, so 10 years earlier. So the Philadelphia Fountain Society followed the vein of the, let's just call it the Cattle Trough Association, lot shorter, and the same intention was to create improvements because people were moving to the cities, so improvements for city life, for urban life, with public health, animal welfare, temperance advocacy, all kind of combined in the installation of these fountains. So by September 1869, 10 years after the London Fountain Society, essentially, the Philadelphia Fountain Society had overseen the creation of 12 fountains right away, right off the bat, started, and they created 12 fountains. The Pennsylvania branch of the ASPCA, which was the PSPCA, they contributed an additional 5. So now you have the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the PSPCA, who intertwines the Fountain Society's endeavors. And it almost became a rivalry between the Pennsylvania Society of the PSPCA and the Fountain Society. So you have, as of September 1869, dozens of fountains already operational. And you have from the Fountain Society, and then you have the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and they're contributing these 5 fountains. So they're just kind of building these fountains, and both of them are just kind of, they have this friendly competition in their collective mission to enhance the well-being of both humans and non-human animals. And so some of these fountains, you can see they have several components, and many of these fountains still survive today. And you can see the curb level troughs for small animals, you can see separate drinking fountains for people, and you can see the larger bowls for the larger animals, for horses. Now, you remember Carolyn Earl White, our amazing dedicated activist who co-founded the PSPCA. She found herself sidelined by the men who were excluding her from decision-making processes from the PSPCA, even though she founded it, she co-founded it. In response to this, she established the women's branch, which became an independent auxiliary with its own mission to foster compassion and welfare for animals. And so in 1899, White broke away from the PSPCA and founded the autonomous Women's Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. I know these are all long names and long initials, but basically the WPSPCA. And it still exists today as the Women's Humane Society or the Women's Animal Shelter in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. So this organization, if you are there and you know the Women's Humane Society or the Women's Animal Shelter in Bensalem, this is a direct line from Carolyn Earl White's WPSPCA, and that broke off from the PSPCA. And don't forget, the American Anti-Vivisection Society is also something Caroline Earl White co-founded, and we have that organization, that incredible organization, still today. So she should be a household name. Now, of course, even today, one individual person cannot do this on their own. We need a village to do this work, and especially we need funding. And so Annie Lowry was vice president of the WPSPCA, and she became a crucial pillar of support. She was from a wealthy family. She was married to a wealthy husband. She was in this wealthy family. And so she provided not only financial assistance, but also dedications. She became a real steadfast supporter of White and her endeavors. And so she sponsored a lot of these fountains at prominent intersections in Pennsylvania. And this leads me to our first memorial to animal advocates in this part 2 of our series. And that's a memorial specifically to Annie Lowry, built as part of the effort to help animals, but also named for the woman who funded many of them. So Annie Lowry used her wealth to improve the lives of animals and funded a lot of these fountains. And while we don't have a specific physical memorial to White, as we talked about in part 1, we do have 2 memorials, actually 3 that I know of. There are probably more, to Lowry, and photos to document at least, well, we have photos to document the memorials to her, the animal fountains to her, and a trough to her. But we actually have a photo from 1910 of Caroline Earl White with a group of WPSPCA supporters at a dedication for a new water fountain for horses. This is a fountain built in 1910, and it's in honor of Annie Lowry. And etched into the stone are the words, "Drink, gentle friends." So this was a woman, Annie Lowry, who dedicated her time and her skills and her resources to animals, and whose name is not really known among animal advocates, but we have that particular fountain dedicated to her. It still stands today. We also have, in addition to the more well-known memorial fountain, this one's on 3rd Street in Philadelphia, we also have the Annie Lowry Memorial Horse Trough. This is nearby the larger one on 2nd Street. Now, it doesn't look like, if you didn't know it was a horse trough, you would think it was a poorly made bench. You would think it looks like a hollowed out bench. It looks like a hollowed out concrete slab, and it was a hollowed out concrete slab. It was a trough. And this is another memorial to Annie, memorializing her work and her funding of it. And also, it obviously was a working trough for horses. And then finally, there's another one. There's a Lowry Memorial Horse Trough at Roxborough High School at Ridge and Fountain Street in Philadelphia. It's now a planter, but if you want to take a little walking tour of Philadelphia fountains for animals, you can see the one still at Roxborough High School at Ridge Avenue and Fountain Street in Philadelphia, which is now a planter. So all of these were funded by and memorialized to Annie. So if you see Annie Lowry on any of these structures or any structures in Philadelphia, you know it was because she was the one who funded them. When she died in 1908, so I mentioned the photo we have is from 1910 because it was after she died that the first fountain was built in her name in 1810. That's the photo we have with Caroline Earl White and other WPSPCA members in honor of Annie. She died in 1908, and she left $58,000, which was a lot of money at that time, to the WPSPCA. And she included $10,000 for fountains in Philadelphia for horses and smaller animals, and $20,000 for that first animal shelter in the U.S. And all of this is mentioned in Lowry's 1908 obituary. It says, quote, "Woman bequeaths $450,000 to charity." So she had also contributed a lot more to other causes. $83,000 for the animals. And it says Mrs. Annie Lowry's cat and parrots to get $5,000. So we've talked in the past about making sure you have a will and a trust for your animals and making sure you have a plan in place for your animals after you die. And indeed, Annie Lowry, and by 1908 when she died, she'd already had it written in her will that her cat and her parrots would get $5,000, which again is a lot of money at that time. So that was Annie Lowry, who obviously is very deserving of recognition. She funded a lot of the fountains. I don't think she had a stipulation that she wanted her name on them, but she is honored for that, and you can still celebrate her today, and she still is celebrated today in Philadelphia in those structures. So impressively, by 1880, so she died in 1908, but by 1880, and remember the Philadelphia Fountain Society was founded in 1869. So by 1880, there were 50 fountains in operation, and they were serving millions of humans and over 1 million horses and other animals. And so this momentum just really took off, and the WPSPCA was behind it, and it continued into the 1940s, and many of these fountains still exist, some of which we talked about in part 1. They were built as monuments to specific SPCAs and the people behind them. Some of them are still in working order. Some of them have become planters. Some of them were damaged but rebuilt and renovated. So they're just these incredible reminders of the work being done for animals back in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Now, before we move on to more animal drinking fountains that still memorialize the individuals who funded or maintained them, I want to go back a little bit in time to give even more context to what became a burgeoning movement in the US by the mid 1800s, right? And that requires us to go back and look briefly at the animal protection movement and its founders in the UK. And they were an inspiration, as I mentioned, to everyone we've been talking about so far. And some of these people have their own monuments and statues and memorials that aren't fountains, but that's the topic. That is the reason we're talking about this today. Who were these people? Who are the people who still have monuments to them today, who were fighting for animals back a long time ago? People like William Wilberforce. You've heard me talk about him before. In the 17 years I've been doing this episode, you have certainly heard me talk about William Wilberforce. He was born in 1759. He died in 1833. He was a member of the British Parliament, and he was a dedicated abolitionist. He was brought up in a very compassionate and empathetic household. His father was incredibly compassionate, and he died, unfortunately, when he was still young. And so he was brought up by his aunt and uncle. William was. He was brought up by Hannah and William Wilberforce, his aunt and uncle. Also got a strong foundation from them, a strong moral foundation. They were very religious. He was also influenced very early on in his life by John Newton. If this name is familiar to you, I hope it is. He should also be a household name. He was a former slave ship captain. So talk about people being able to change and, have a new consciousness and change their lives because of a shift in thinking. He was a slave ship captain who turned abolitionist and evangelist. He became committed to social change. He was deeply impacted by his time as a slave ship captain, and he deeply impacted Wilberforce and ignited his passion for making a difference. So again, in terms of the ripple effect that individuals have on other individuals, I'm just incredibly moved by that. Now, the reason you would know John Newton is because he is the author of the hymn Amazing Grace, which characterizes his own experience of once having captained slave ships to becoming an ardent abolitionist. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. That is his autobiographical journey of having once been part of the slave trade and then becoming an abolitionist. So there's hope for everyone all the time. So at the age of 21, Wilberforce entered Parliament, and he represented Hull, Kingston upon Hull, and then later Yorkshire. And his main focus was the abolition of the slave trade. And he advocated this cause for 2 decades, tirelessly, with a lot of difficulty and a lot of criticism, a lot of pushback. And it culminated in the passing of the Slave Trade Act in 1807. Now, this was landmark legislation. It made the transportation of slaves illegal. It significantly reduced the practice. Of course, it wasn't the abolition of the slave trade yet. That would take another 26 years because of people holding on to the slave trade. But it did finally happen, over the course of the whole of the British Empire by 1833. And Wilberforce was able to witness it, luckily, before his death in 1833. He was still young, but he did get to see the end of slavery by 1833. But he was instrumental in the passing of the Slave Trade Act in 1807. And in addition to his efforts in abolishing slavery, he worked on other fronts as well. Once again, we can care about more than one cause at a time, and he did. He championed prison reform, workers' rights, education, and animal welfare. And so he was part of the early founding of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, an organization that introduced measures to ensure humane treatment for both domestic and working animals. So I highly recommend reading everything you can about the history of the early animal protection movement in the UK. And if you want to see a fictional account of his life and dedication to justice and compassion, you can watch the 2007 film Amazing Grace. And it's worth seeing. I watched it in the theater when it was out in 2007. I would rewatch it. I remember it being quite lovely. And it's just lovely to have a film that memorializes someone who actually was working on behalf of both humans and non-humans, and that is depicted in the film. It does include his animal protection work. So you can watch the 2007 film Amazing Grace, which I would say, in a way, is a memorial to the work of this man. Memorials don't just come in physical structures. They are poems. They are podcasts, episodes. They are films. They are books. They are many things. They are also physical structures. Now, in terms of physical structures, Wilberforce is memorialized with several monuments around the UK because he really was such a dominant figure in the UK in especially the 19th century. He's memorialized, rightfully so, for his work on behalf of, abolition, not specifically for his work on behalf of animals. But I do feel that the way I felt with Caroline Earle White, the continued work of her, AAVS, the American Anti-Vivisection Society, still in existence, the Women's Humane Society still in existence. Those are also memorials to her. And I would say the RSPCA is also a memorial to Wilberforce because it still continues to protect animals to this day. I will say that I would argue that there is a memorial to him, in a way, I'm going to argue my case, that does have to do with his animal protection work, and that's this. There is a gorgeous octagonal neo-Gothic fountain in London that I think alludes to his work on behalf of animals, and that is the Buxton Memorial Fountain. I visited this on my first trip to London 2 decades ago. It is a gorgeous fountain. It's a gorgeous design. It commemorates the emancipation of slaves in the British Empire in 1834, and in particular, the role of British parliamentarians in the abolition campaign. And of course, Wilberforce is one of those men, of course they were all men, named on this fountain as one of the parliamentarians who was instrumental in ending the slave trade in the British Empire. So he is named there. The design was it was a collaborative effort between Buxton, so that's why it's called the Buxton Memorial Fountain. He was an amateur architect and an architect named Samuel Sanders Toulon. And they worked together in 1865, and the memorial was finished in 1866. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because one of the elements that Toulon included in this memorial fountain, first of all, you have mosaics of animals. That's not why I would include it in memorials to animal advocates, because some of these were, fables and kind of typical animal scenes you would see. However, I think because it is a water fountain that included basins for both large and small animals, that I'm including it as a monument to people like Wilberforce. I don't think it would have been lost on Toulon when he was designing this fountain, that Wilberforce, having been one of the people who was instrumental in the ending of the slave trade and was instrumental in the animal protection movement in the UK, I don't think it would have been lost on him that Wilberforce was part of both of those campaigns. And so I think, because if you look at it, you wouldn't actually look at it as a fountain. It looks like the top of a Gothic cathedral. It's so beautiful. So look it up, Buxton Memorial Fountain. And you wouldn't know it was a fountain until you start looking at the specifics. Now, I'm going to have the pictures of it on my website at joyfulvegan.com for this episode, but take a look at it. So I think it gets included for Wilberforce because of that. Now, there are other monuments to Wilberforce specifically because of his work ending the slave trade or helping to end the slave trade. And that is, you see in Hull, there's a couple different statues of him. One is a Doric column which it has Wilberforce at the very top of it. It kind of looks like Nelson's column in London for Nelson. It's very reminiscent of that. So it's quite a massive memorial, and that's in Hull. And then there's another one outside of Wilberforce House, which is now a museum in High Street in Hull. And that was erected in 1883. So he died, remember I said, in 1833. And the first statue was actually completed by 1834. So you could see how very quickly he was commemorated upon his death. And then in 1883, probably to coincide with the 50th anniversary of his death, that's where you see that second statue outside the Wilberforce house. And so his legacy endures to this day. The legacy of Richard Martin. I've talked about Richard Martin. He was known as Humanity Dick. Louis Gompertz. He was also part of the founding of the RSPCA. These inspiring individuals inspired individuals like Henry Bergh and Caroline Earl White in the US to dedicate their lives to animals. So you have the establishment of water fountains and troughs across England, continuing to stand as testimony to this legacy. These fountains and troughs were strategically placed also in urban centers, also to provide practical relief for people and to provide practical relief for non-human animals. Now, that foundation that I mentioned, the Cattle Trough Association, was started in 1859. That's the one that inspired Dr. Swan to start the Philadelphia Fountain Society in 1869. That association's purpose started off to provide free drinking water for people. It was originally just called the Metropolitan Free Drinking Fountain Association. In 1867, it was changed to include cattle troughs as well, reflecting its focus also on animal welfare. And today you have dozens of these fountains and troughs all over London. And again, I'll have photos of them at joyfulvegan.com. Now, we know they exist because we can see them. We know they exist because of records that we have from these associations, but we also know they exist because we have a passage from Charles Dickens in the Dickens Dictionary of London in 1879, who wrote this. This is under a passage called Drinking Fountains. And here's what he writes. Until the last few years, London was ill provided with public drinking fountains and cattle troughs. This matter is now well looked after by the Metropolitan Drinking Fountain and Cattle Trough Association, which has erected and now maintains nearly 800 fountains and troughs, at which an enormous quantity of water is consumed daily. It's estimated that 300,000 people take advantage of the fountains on a summer's day, and a single trough has supplied the wants of 1,800 horses in one period of 24 hours. Several ornamental fountains have been provided by private munificence. Amongst these may be instanced the Baroness Burdett Coutts' beautiful fountains in Victoria Park and Regent's Park, the Maharaja in Hyde Park, Mrs. Brown's by Thornycroft in Hamilton Place, Mr. Wheeler's at the north of Kew Bridge, and Mr. Buxton's at Westminster. There you go. There's the Buxton fountain we just talked about. So these were a significant part of city life, and everyone knew about them. So let's move on to make, I think, are some really fun connections to people we've talked about and to some new people who are also memorialized with fountains. In 1877, now just kind of remember your time period here, right? So 1833, Wilberforce dies. 1859, we have the Fountain Association in the Cattle Trough Association in the UK. 1869, we've got the Philadelphia Fountain Association. So now 1877. So you again remember also from part one, 1850s, 1860s is when Henry Bergh is starting the ASPCA. So the mid 1800s was a time where animal welfare was really on the minds of people because of the organizations like the RSPCA in the UK and the ASPCA in the US. By 1877, you've got people very aware of laws that are being passed to protect animals, the criticism against these laws, people pushing back, court cases, Henry Bergh on the streets trying to stop people from abusing horses. It was prevalent in people's minds. So in 1877, a book was published by a writer whose sole intention was to raise awareness of the plight of these animals and to send a message to the public who might have otherwise been looking the other way. This book is still one of the best-selling books ever. Ever. Do you know what it is? The full title of this book was originally Black Beauty, His Grooms and Companions, the Autobiography of a Horse, translated from the original Equine by Anna Sewell. And indeed, Anna Sewell was the voice for this horse who served as the ambassador for all horses in his shoes. I almost said in his hooves, but anyway. Fine, I just said it. So Sewell was born into a Quaker family in Yarmouth, England. And she continued the literary tradition set by her mother. Her mother was also a writer of children's books. Her name was Mary Wright Sewell. And Anna's purpose with Black Beauty was different. She wasn't just looking to create lovely stories for children. She wanted to convey a message not only to children, but to the adults who held the reins of responsibility. I didn't mean that to be an etymology or another allusion to horses, but there you go, for their lives and for the well-being of the horses under their care. Because these are the people, the adults, the parents of these children who really were responsible for the well-being of these animals, right? In Victorian England, it was a unique decision to write the book as an animal autobiography. It had never been done before. And it really garnered a lot of public interest. This was the first instance of a novel being written from an animal's perspective. It was revolutionary. And so in just 2 years, and I can tell you this is a big deal from someone who is a writer, 1 million copies of Black Beauty were circulating in the US. And animal rights activists regularly shared the book with horse drivers and stable hands, reflecting the impact. And this is what she wanted. This is what she wanted. Now, sadly, Sewell did not have the opportunity to witness the success of her work. She passed away only 5 months after the book's 1877 publication. Nonetheless, her accomplishment was significant. Black Beauty was groundbreaking, and it reshaped perceptions of and care practices for horses. And in fact, George Thorndike Angell prior to this, had spent years searching for a book that would inspire people to treat animals humanely. He likened it to Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's what he wanted. He wanted an Uncle Tom's Cabin to advance the abolitionist movement for animal cruelty, the same way Uncle Tom's Cabin had advanced the abolitionist movement that led to the ban on human slavery. So in 1890, so remember, Black Beauty came out in 1877. In 1890, someone brought Black Beauty to Angell's attention, and he knew it was the right book immediately to further his cause. By the time he died in 1909, Angell had distributed around 2 million copies of the book to school children. So remember, Angell was really focused on humane education and compassion among children and starting young. And so remember, bands of mercy were in cities and towns and schools all across the country. So if you want a way to, advocate for animals, please do not underestimate donating books. I mean, seriously, you could buy 100 copies, 200 copies. I've talked about you buying copies from me from the 30-day vegan challenge. I would sell them to you at cost, and you can buy 100 copies and you can distribute them to doctors' offices, people schools, libraries, right? That's an example of, in any book, it doesn't have to be 30-day vegan challenge, any book, many books. If you want to find a way to say, I got $1,000, how can I spend $1,000? Buy books and donate them to schools. They will appreciate them as part of humane education, right? And so he, by the time he died, between 1890 and 1909, had distributed 2 million copies of the book to children. And as I said, to this day, Black Beauty is one of the most popular books in history. It has sold more than 50 million copies in 50 languages. It's pretty amazing. Now, when I say that Angell distributed over 2 million copies, he wasn't just doing it individually. He was doing it through his organization. Remember, he was the founder of the MSPCA and the Bands of Mercy. And through these organizations, he had created a publication Again, I mentioned this in the first episode, called Our Dumb Animals. And again, remember, dumb does not mean stupid. And so we have a story. If you want to just enjoy some reading of history and the animal protection history, please just read some of these old issues from Our Dumb Animals. There is in there, we have a story from 1892. I'm going to include the link at the website at joyfulvegan.com. You can see a story about Black Beauty written in Our Dumb Animals by George Angel about Black Beauty. And so I'll include links to it. It's just incredible. And so we have a fountain memorializing Anna Sewell in Connecticut, at the corner of Cottage Avenue and South Cliff Street, if you are there, in a town called Ansonia. And it was dedicated in 1892 to Anna Sewell. In memoriam, Anna Sewell, author of Black Beauty, it says. And the globe topping the column says, "Blessed are the merciful," and it includes a horse trough. And so this particular memorial was dedicated to Anna Sewell by Stokes, a woman named Caroline Phelps Stokes. She was a philanthropist who funded the construction of several college chapels and made donations to a variety of causes, including those for animals. And she's the one who funded this fountain. Another example of a wealthy individual using their wealth to for the greater good. And so she stands today. Anna Sewell is memorialized because of her work for horses, having written Black Beauty. And I think she would be quite grateful and quite pleased with the success of this book. And it inspired many people, including our next subject. And that is a man who was quite influenced by Black Beauty, the book, and that is Cleveland Amory. He was born in 1917. So just to give you perspective, again, this is the same month and year, September 1917, Caroline Earl White died. Okay, and Cleveland Amory, you probably know his name. He was an American author, journalist. He was an animal rights advocate. He played a significant role in raising awareness about animal protection issues, particularly through his writings and his advocacy efforts. So first of all, I would say once again, the memorials to him continue because of the books he wrote, and I'll tell you what they are in just a moment. And and the organizations, I'll talk about the organizations and then I'll talk about the physical memorials. But like for so many of us, and like for Berg and Angel, it was when he saw animals being abused that his life completely changed. He was inspired to work on behalf of animals after bearing witness to a bullfight in Mexico around 1945. And so in 1967, Amory founded the Fund for Animals, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating for animal rights and protecting wildlife. And I talk about this a bit in the episode I did from 2017, a few years ago, called The Bell of Attree. And I also talked about him a bit in the Burden of Burrows episode. But for those who didn't listen or remember, the Fund for Animals became well known in 1979 for sponsoring a removal by air and land of 580 Grand Canyon burros, donkeys, slated for destruction by the National Park Service. It was the largest animal rescue ever accomplished, and a very, very difficult one, and not a single animal was hurt, which is quite remarkable. And so they needed a new home for all of these burros, 580 of them. And so soon after, Amory was able to accomplish his lifelong dream of creating an animal sanctuary for abused and neglected animals. And so he founded a sanctuary he called Black Beauty Ranch. Now you see the connection here, why he called it Black Beauty. It's in Murchison, Texas. I have been there. It's an incredible time. I spent a long time there several years ago. It's run by HSUS now, by the Humane Society of the United States. It's part of the Humane Society of the United States. And it's a beautiful place. If there are any fundraisers there, I think they're closed. I don't think they're open to public tours. But I think they do have events there, especially as fundraisers. So he opened the sanctuary inspired by Anna Sewell's novel, and it's 1,400 acres. There are animals who were abused from, entertainment, from research. There's chimpanzees, there's burros, obviously, there's elephants, there are lots and lots of horses. And so you can read all about the Grand Canyon Burro Rescue and the founding of Black Beauty in his book, Amory's book, from 1997 called Ranch of Dreams. Now, I mentioned the books that Amory wrote. He's most known for his book, certainly by the public, not just animal advocates, the book, The Cat Who Came for Christmas. He wrote that in 1987, and there were several sequels. He also wrote a book in 1974 called Mankind, ? Our Incredible War on Wildlife, and that shed light on animal welfare issues, criticized the way humans treat animals. He explored the ethical and moral aspects of our relationship with animals, obviously called for compassion. And so 10 years later, after that, he wrote The Cat Who Came for Christmas. It became a very popular book, and the sequels became very popular. And it details, The Cat Who Came for Christmas, his personal experiences with animals, particularly his cat named Polar Bear. And so these stories humanize animals. They emphasize our emotional connections with other animals. And so he continued to advocate for animals through his writing, also through television. He had a television show called Animals, Animals, Animals in the 1980s, which also aimed to educate viewers about animal behavior and nature and wildlife. So he basically used his platform as a writer and an advocate to raise awareness, to challenge societal norms, to push for legislative changes, and his legacy continues to this day. Now, he died in 1998, and when he did, he was cremated, and his ashes were spread across Black Beauty Ranch, near where his favorite burro, was named Friendly. Where Friendly was buried, his ashes were spread across where Friendly was buried. And so there are some memorials to Amory at Black Beauty. There are 3 dedicated to Amory and the work he did. So one is a memorial of Friendly the donkey, right, who was a very friendly donkey, and she was one of the first to be rescued out of Grand Canyon. And he talks about Friendly in his book Ranch of Dreams, and I'll get back to this because he talks about how her regular greeting was pushing her head into my stomach, is what he wrote. Next to Friendly's memorial, you have a headstone of Polar Bear, the cat, the beloved cat who was rescued by Amory and who's the subject of the book, The Cat Who Came for Christmas. And then, and a huge reason also that Cleveland became an animal activist. And so Polar Bear is there and he's memorialized. And then the center of this memorial is dedicated to Cleveland Amory himself. After his death, he was buried there. His ashes were spread there, and this memorial was created. So you can go see, when you go to Black Beauty, the memorial to him there on the property. Again, I have photos of these on my website, but there is another memorial I found when I was doing research for this episode, and that's this really beautiful sculpture by a sculptor in, where is she? I don't remember where she is. But her name is Kitty Cantrell. I'll include a photo of this beautiful life-size sculpture of Amory with Friendly pushing his head up against Cleveland Amory's chest. And it's based on a very famous photo. You'll see a photo of Amory and Friendly, and this sculpture is absolutely beautiful. I reached out to the sculptor because I wanted to know where this sculpture was. She's not sure where it is. She thinks it might be at Black Beauty at this point. She was a volunteer at the time for the Fund for Animals Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in California. So she might be in California. And she said she thinks the sculpture was moved. It was commissioned by the Fund for Animals. And she thinks it's now at Black Beauty Ranch in Murchison, Texas. So you can go check that out. But I will have a photo of it. It's absolutely beautiful. This is a sculptor you could always commission a sculpture from. She's quite talented. And then I want to, as we start to wind down this episode, I started in part 1 talking about memorials to animal advocates. I started with Oakland, my city that I live in, and I want to close this episode, get close to the episode, with another story of Oakland, and then we're going to wrap up with a couple names who you would not know, but these are just individuals whose names are not household names, they're not famous people, but there are memorials to them because of their work on behalf of animals. So before I get there, I want to just talk about this more, again, elaborate, beautiful fountain that was funded by people back in the 19th century who were advocates for animals at that time. And so if you came to my Joyful Vegan event, the Compassion in Action conference, a few years ago, we did a walking tour of Oakland and its animal protection history. And you might remember we stopped at the Latham Fountain in downtown Oakland. And the Latham Fountain is it was erected in honor of James and Henrietta Latham for their work on for animals. And so James Latham worked for Wells Fargo, and he and his wife moved from Ohio to San Francisco in 1869 and eventually moved to Oakland. He died in 1876, but Henrietta continued her work for animals. I don't know if I think I talked about it in an episode, she wrote what appears to be one of the first vegetarian cookbooks. Or I should say, she wrote what was one of the first vegetarian cookbooks. I don't know if it was the first. Published in 1898, called The Golden Age Cookbook. And it was published by the Alliance Publishing Company. And the volume had a beautiful embossed cover with gilt. And it had over 300 recipes, including sweet potato croquettes. This is 1898. Mock fish chops, mock chicken, and lots of other recipes for vegetables and soups and cakes and sweets, vegetarian. The introduction itself is an appeal to compassionate people who care about animals. And it says, if that doesn't persuade you, how about violence created in the people who kill animals? Like literally, she was talking about all the different ways. Okay, do you care about animals? Great, don't eat them. Do you care about people? Great, then don't eat animals because you're contributing to violence and the desensitization of people who kill animals. That doesn't move you? How about health? It's healthier. Does that move you? Oh, that doesn't work? How about it takes less land and fewer resources to raise animals for human consumption? So she's using all of these multi-prong arguments that we still use today in the forward of her cookbook before she gets onto the recipes, like so many of us do today. So Henrietta, died in 1909 in Paris, but she is buried in Mountain View Cemetery, where I will be buried and my husband will be buried. We have a plot there, and where my mother is currently buried and will remain buried. And she's buried with James, her husband, and her son Charles, and other Lathams in the Latham family grave. So after her mother's death, her daughter, Edith, furthered her family's work in animal activism by becoming the president of the Latham Foundation for the Promotion of Humane Education, whose purpose was to teach humane education in schools, and whose offices were in the Latham Square building overlooking the fountain. So the fountain, the Latham Memorial Fountain, situated in Latham Square, it's still called Latham Square, it's the intersection of Telegraph and Broadway here in Oakland, was unveiled during a ceremony led by the City of Oakland and the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals on April 12th, 1913. The fountain was a gift from Edith and Milton Latham, Edith and her husband, who wanted to honor her parents, James and Henrietta Latham, for their compassion towards animals. So you can see this beautiful fountain. It's gorgeous. I'll include photos, and there's some beautiful depictions of angels who are coming to try and change someone who's beating a horse, and there are horse troughs, and there are dog bowls, basins for dogs for water. So it's quite a beautiful fountain, and I encourage you to check it out. And then finally, I want to talk briefly about someone I have admired for many years, someone who is known mostly as an environmentalist and conservationist, but who is also a voice for animals. I am thinking of doing an episode on him specifically, but I want to honor John Muir, who I think we just think of as someone who is protecting the spaces animals lived in, which of course protects animals, but he was also speaking for individual animals. So John Muir, you would have heard of. He was born in Scotland, in Dunbar, Scotland, in 1838, and he died in Los Angeles, California, in 1914. So you're seeing this time period is all the same kind of time period where there was this just a surge in people leading the way for environmentalism and animal protection. So I'll talk more about him another time, but I wanted to just name him. There are so many statues and monuments to John Muir that I do not want to just sit here and list them. I'm going to include them on my podcast, on the website at joyfulvegan.com. We'll talk about him in another episode, but there are too many to name. There are busts of him. There are full sculptures of him. There are wooden sculptures. There are bronze sculptures. They're in California. They're in Dunbar, Scotland. They're obviously in California, in the different parks that he was instrumental in creating and protecting, Kings Canyon and Sequoia and Yosemite. He is honored in so many places. One thing I would say is if you do come out to Northern California, and you're going to probably go to Yosemite, I would really encourage you to go to Martinez, which is where he lived. There's actually a memorial park there, and we've been there. There's, of course, a statue there to him, but his home was there, and you can go see where he lived. It's a wonderful exhibit. I really, really recommend it, and you can also hike kind of right around there. So if you want like a little outing from the Bay Area, so even if you live in the Bay Area, I really encourage you to go to Martinez. It's right on the water. There's actually some really cool old buildings from when Martinez was kind of a thriving port town, and now it's a bit more depressed, and I mean that financially depressed, but it is starting to come back, and it's really a cool town, and there's some really cool old pubs that you can go into and have beer, have a glass of wine, sit right out in the water. But his house is definitely worth visiting, so I encourage you to do that. And so he is memorialized both in his home and the exhibit, of course in his writings, of course in the national parks we need to continue to protect, and of course in these statues and monuments. So these public monuments, as I keep saying, are not just physical fountains or physical statues. They are the legacy of these people who contributed to animals. Now, we have a few more I'm just going to name. Luckily, there are others, and I'm not going to go through all of them today, but I want to give you some hope to say, we are memorializing animal advocates. You can be part of that. There could be someone you might want to see memorialized. Caroline Earl White doesn't have a fountain. She doesn't have a plaque, right? It doesn't have to be a fountain. You don't have to build a fountain, but have it a plaque. Work with Philadelphia and get a plaque to this woman who was instrumental in the protection of animals. And so let me just name a couple here of people who are not household names, but who dedicated their time and lives and resources to animals. So this one's super fun. This one was these are all just finds that happened from the deep, deep research I do for these kinds of topics. And again, your support makes this possible. I spend hours and hours and hours. Yes, it brings me great joy. Yes, it is for the purpose of sharing with you. And I hope you appreciate it, because this is kind of what your support is contributing to. So there's one called Clark Memorial Bench. It's called My Dumb Friends Bench. Again, I know it's really hard to put that word aside, but it's called My Dumb Friends Bench, and it's here in Alameda County. I live in Oakland in Alameda County, but there's also a town called Alameda in Alameda County. And in 1920, Isabella Derby Clark, she was a resident of Park Avenue in Alameda. She donated this concrete bench to the city, and she was a strong advocate for animal welfare. And there's an inscription on the bench that says, "In memory of my dumb friends," paying homage to the animals and their silent presence. Adjacent to the bench's east side, there was a pet watering fountain initially attached. In 2013, apparently, a storm damaged the bench when a palm tree fell on it. But in response, community members, this is in 2013, collaborated with city authorities and nonprofit groups to gather funds to repair the bench and to restore it. And they also have a street lamp at the site as well. So you can go see that bench. You can go sit on that bench in Alameda. And then apparently, just a little FYI, Jim Morrison, attended Alameda High School, he apparently frequented that bench. So you can go sit on that bench that is honoring animals and also where Jim Morrison sat. Also in Alameda County, in the 1970s, there was a marshland. Well, there is a lot of marshland in Alameda. It was facing development. And so Elsie Remer, Roemer, I'm assuming it's pronounced Remer, emerged as a champion for birds who relied on this area for sustenance and shelter, and particularly the endangered California clapper rail. So she dedicated herself to conducting meticulous bird surveys along the shorelines of Alameda and Oakland for many, many years. And because of her record keeping and her organizational skills, all of this played a pivotal role in safeguarding this local marshland. So in recognition of her commitment to preserve wildlife and the wetlands in Alameda, Elsie Remer's friends advocated for the East Bay Regional Park District to name the bird sanctuary after her in 1979. And so it's still called the Elsie B. Remer Bird Sanctuary. Love that. Then you have, moving to Florida, so across the country completely, you have what is a plaque to a man named Columbus McLeod. And this is in Charlotte County, Florida. And the plaque says, Columbus G. McLeod, protector of plumed birds. And so, not surprisingly, there's a lot of wading birds in Florida, in this region of Florida. And because of Columbus McLeod and others like him, he gave his life trying to protect these plumed birds from hunters, from plume hunters. So he died in 1908. So this goes back to, he was born in 1848. So this goes back to a time when women's hats, you might remember this, were adorned with exotic bird feathers. It was a high fashion in the late 1800s. And so thousands of birds were slaughtered in Florida for their plumage. In 1901, the Audubon Society persuaded the state to adopt laws to protect Florida wildlife, especially the birds who were being killed for their plumage. And so the state agreed to deputize 2 wardens hired by the Audubon Society, because the state didn't allocate any funds, but they agreed to deputize 2 wardens hired by the Audubon Society. Sadly, this was very dangerous work, and Columbus McLeod, who was charged with protecting the rookeries in Charlotte Harbor in this area, he disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and he was presumed murdered on November 30th, 1908. Someone prior to him actually had been killed in 1905. Guy Bradley was charged with protecting the Everglades. He was found shot to death in 1905. So the second death, by the time McLeod was presumed murdered, and these were both Audubon wardens who were protecting animals, it sparked a national campaign against the wearing of feathers. It was one of the things that actually led to the decline of birds being killed for feathers in hats and for fashion. And it shifted public sentiment in favor of stronger enforcement of wildlife protection laws and the prosecution of plume hunters. And so, because of these men, quite martyrs, if you will, Florida has wading birds who are now protected because of these men who stepped up to protect these animals and were killed in doing so. So you can see a plaque specifically to Columbus McLeod in Charlotte County, Florida. Then we have a plaque in Illinois. So now we're moving over to Adams County, Illinois, in Quincy. There was a doctor named Dr. Thomas Edgar Musselman. He was born in 1887, died in 1976. He was a naturalist. He was an educator. He was a friend of birds and young people, and he was a lifelong resident of Quincy. There's a plaque to him, and it says, T.E. was loved by all those who shared his knowledge, enthusiasm, and concern for wildlife. He founded the Bluebird Trails to erect and maintain nesting boxes along country roads for the preservation of one of America's most beautiful and appealing birds. So he created bluebird boxes so they could nest, and he is commemorated, he's memorialized for that work in a plaque in Illinois, in Adams County. Then we move to Ohio, and we have another plaque to a man named Jack Miner. This is in Cuyahoga County, Westlake specifically in Ohio. He was a conservationist and a naturalist, and he was born at this site. So this is actually at his birth site. He was born in 1865. He moved to Ontario, Canada in 1878, but he achieved worldwide recognition for his pioneering studies of waterfowl migration. And his work with migrating birds led to the establishment of a bird sanctuary at Kingsville, Ontario. He also had several books published, and there's also an organization called the Jack Miner Migratory Bird Foundation, which was erected in 1875. So there are so many stories like this of individuals like you and you and you who are doing work, who are speaking for animals, and who I hope feel memorialized in my recognition of all of you. I can't put a statue up to each one of you or a fountain, but I just wanted to celebrate the people who have been voices for animals, ambassadors of compassion. The episode that you might be interested in listening to is part 1, what is now part 1, because there will be part 2, of memorials and monuments to individual animals. And that's like super fun. That's like super fun. I sounded very California there. That's like super fun because it's about memorials and monuments to individual animals who are being honored for their bravery or just their connection to their people. So that's that. And that was the inspiration for this one, which is part 2 of Public Monuments to Animal Advocates. So I hope these stories have inspired you. I hope you're moved. I hope it gives you hope. I hope maybe you'll be moved and inspired to build a memorial to someone you think deserves it, whether they're alive or still working on behalf of animals. So thank you so much. And at this point, I'm just going to say, it's only because of the people who are supporting this podcast that I am able to spend the hours I do researching and recording and editing and releasing these episodes. If you have not become a supporter, you can go over to joyfulvegan.com. You can click on donate. You can make a one-time donation. You can become a monthly supporter. That I do encourage you to choose the annual payment because you could just pay all at once, but you're a member for the entire year. I can't do this without you. As you see, I don't have sponsors. I don't have ads. If you want me to go do that, that's going to be an entirely different ballgame. I would rather not do that. And so if this is something you value, please become a supporter. And if you haven't renewed, please consider renewing. And if you haven't checked your credit card, please go check your credit card. The donations are down. They're just completely plummeting. And so it's making it harder and harder for me to be able to support this work. So I hope you consider becoming a supporter today and joining our Patreon family. Thank you so much. You'll enjoy perks besides hearing these episodes. You get discounts, you get first dibs on things, and some levels you have contact with me directly. We have monthly phone calls together. So there's lots of perks. The main thing is I hope this inspired you. Thank you for being a voice for animals. Thank you for supporting, for subscribing, and for listening. For the animals, this is Colleen Patrick-Goudreau. Take care.